This video is about formal charge. By the end of this video, you should understand why we need formal charge, be able to assign formal charge to all atoms in a Lewis structure, and be able to use formal charge to choose among valid Lewis structures. Consider the Lewis structures here for the sulfate ion. Note that the sulfate ion's Lewis structure must contain 32 electrons. Both of these Lewis structures contain all 32 electrons, and neither Lewis structure violates any rules. Here, all of our atoms have a full octet, and on this side, all of our atoms have a full octet except for sulfur, which exceeds the octet rule. This is okay though, since sulfur very often exceeds the octet rule. Therefore, we haven't broken any rules here. So, how do we decide between these two different but valid Lewis structures? For this, we need formal charge. Formal charge is the difference between the number of valence electrons on the free atom and the number of valence electrons assigned to the atom in the molecule. Note that this is an estimate of charge only, however, it's useful in helping us decide between Lewis structures. The rules for assigning Lewis structures may sound complicated, I'll lay them out here, but once we put them into practice, you'll see that they're quite simple. First, lone pairs belong entirely to the atom they are on. Therefore, all lone pairs count as 2 electrons for that atom. Shared pairs are divided equally between sharing atoms. Therefore, we count 1 electron in each bond for each of the atoms, making up the bond. So to calculate, we take the sum of the lone pairs and half of the shared pairs, since they're divided equally, and subtract this result from the number of valence electrons the atom has when not in a molecule. Once we've assigned formal charge to all the atoms in the molecule, we have a few guiding principles to help us determine which Lewis structure is best. First, the sum of the formal charges on all atoms in the molecule or ion must equal the overall charge of the molecule or ion. So if it's a neutral molecule, they should add up to 0. If it's an ion, they should add up to the ion's charge. The best Lewis structure is the one that gives a formal charge of 0 to as many atoms as possible, and a negative formal charge only to highly electronegative atoms. So things like fluorine, oxygen, and nitrogen may often have negative formal charges, and that's okay. When other elements have a negative formal charge, that may be problematic. Let's consider the example we saw before. Starting first with the Lewis structure on the left, let's consider this oxygen here. Oxygen, as we know, has 6 valence electrons. In this structure, it has 2, 4, 6, and 7, since we count each bond as 1, meaning it has a formal charge of -1. 6 minus 7 is -1. Notice the other 3 oxygens have the same structures, therefore they'll all also have a -1 formal charge. Sulfur has 6 valence electrons, but in this structure it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 from each bond, giving it a formal charge of +2. Note that these formal charges, when added, +2 plus 4 -1s, gives us the -2, which is the charge for this ion. Let's compare that to the formal charges in our competing structure on the right. Again, these 2 oxygens have the same structure as the ones we saw before, so they'll each have -1 formal charges. However, these oxygens, again, start with 6 valence electrons and now have 2, 4, 5, 6. So each of them will have a formal charge of 0, since 6 minus 6 is 0. Turning to sulfur, sulfur starts with 6 valence electrons and now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in this structure, giving it a formal charge of 0. Again, overall, our formal charges add up to -2. However, this structure on the right is a better Lewis structure than the one on the left, because more of its atoms have a formal charge of 0. This is called minimizing formal charge. Note also that the only atoms with negative formal charges are oxygen, and oxygen is a highly electronegative element. Here we've used the concept of formal charge to decide between these 2 valid structures. Here's some examples to try on your own. Pause the video here and assign formal charge to each of the atoms in each of the molecules. Note that I've only given you 1 Lewis structure in each case. This is the valid Lewis structure. I just want you to practice assigning formal charge. When you come back, I'll reveal the answers. Welcome back. Here's what you should have gotten. Note that in both cases, all of the formal charges add up to 0, since both molecules are neutral. That brings us to the end of this video. Let's review our goals. First, we looked at why we need to use formal charge to help us decide between valid Lewis structures. Then we learned how to assign formal charge to all atoms in a Lewis structure. And finally, we learned to use formal charge to choose among valid Lewis structures.